Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is novelist Patti Callahan. Only 2 years ago, Callahan published a best-selling novel, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, about the courtship and marriage of British Christian thinker and novelist C.S. Lewis. Now Callahan is back with a new novel. It's part contemporary catastrophe thriller and part historical recreation of 19th century Savannah. I spoke with Patti Callahan in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Patti, it is nice to see you again.
I am so happy to be here.
Well,
in person, in real life.
Not Zooming.
It's amazing.
Not distance, not virtual, but
one
in
on
the
one.
flesh, so to speak.
Face to face.
The last time we spoke, it was only a couple of years ago, and you had a great success with Becoming Mrs. Lewis. That book, I enjoyed it, but it became a bestseller.
Yeah.
And it occurred, and afterwards I thought, this is an unusual book to be a bestseller. It's a book about a Christian intellectual.
Exactly.
And a kind of semi-paralyzed American woman poet. And somehow or other, they meet, they court, they marry. Looking back with all the interviews that you did and all the reviews that you got, why do you think that book was as popular and as just warmly received as it was?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that is a really good question. I think, first of all, we never know what the reader's consciousness, what's happening. You know, if we did know, we could plan our books better, but we never know what's going to hit. And I think the allure or the interest in Becoming Mrs. Lewis has to do with a couple things. One is it is a completely improbable love story. An American poet who was married with 2 children, who had never left New York except for about 6 months as a screenwriter in Hollywood, and a Christian, and she's an atheist, married with 2 kids, and a Christian apologist and famous professor across the ocean. How in the world?
Well, she's even a Jewish atheist.
Yes, ex-Jewish, ex-communist atheist. So I think the improbable part of that is a huge allure. The second thing is, you know, C.S. Lewis can become this kind of marble statue that we put on a pedestal, and he can become a quotable meme. And in this book, we meet the human that is C.S. Lewis. And I think that is sometimes infuriates people. They don't like to think of their heroes as human, but also is intriguing.
Well, now he wasn't exactly made of marble,
Absolutely
but he was not
not.
exactly a romantic pushover either.
No.
He had the strictest ethical code I have ever read about in a love story.
Yep.
It took her how long before he finally understood that he was being courted, that he was wanted?
I know. I think, you know, I spent so long trying to figure out his resistance.
Yep.
And part of it was his age, and he lived in a world of men. And, you know, he was an Oxford professor. He was part of the Inklings. It was the 1940s and 1950s in England. But at the same time, I think a lot of it had to do with that he was truly a medievalist, and he believed in the virtues. And she was a married woman with 2 children. But yes, they were pen pals for almost 3 years. They were friends for almost 3 years before finally the words "I love you" fell out of his mouth. And I do know, and you know, anybody who's studied it knows, he did fall in love with her mind first, which is my favorite part of the story.
And I think it's not that rare. I think we have a kind of Hollywood notion of 2 beautiful people, you know, a movie star and a starlet, and they're attracted visually, physically.
Boom, love
yeah.
at first sight.
But I think an awful lot of good many human relationships actually get going when people like
Meet mind to mind.
Right, in some fashion, yes.
One of his most famous quotes is that when you look at someone and say, oh, you too? I thought I was the only one? That's when a friendship begins. And that's what happened with them over letters, and then it was a friendship, and then at some point he went, wait a minute. Yes, it was a slow burn, for sure.
In a sense, Becoming Mrs. Lewis is historical novel, in a sense. I mean, I was alive the whole time, so it wasn't exactly the Renaissance. But whatever taste you got for that kind of thing, you've really accelerated. Anyway, we've gone farther back in time.
Yes.
The new novel takes place in two time periods. One time period is it the
1838.
Well, I thought, what's the new one?
Oh, the 29. The Surviving Savannah.
Yeah.
It takes place in 1838 and 2019.
All right.
We go back and forth in time.
Right. The two, 1838. We'll get to that in a moment. The event, you have this lovely, tormented young woman. She's so sad. Everly is alive in 2019, and she's sad. And it's interesting. You have to sell this in the book. She was at a parade. Mm-hmm. She was standing next to her best friend. A car accidentally drives into the crowd. It's not a murder or anything like that. It's an accident. And her best friend is killed.
Right next to her.
Right next to her, inches away, we could say. And it nearly undoes her. And what you're doing there, later you'll do it with the steamship Pulaski explosion. But what you're doing right there in 2019 is exploring survivor guilt. Yes. What do you think about that? I don't think I have that.
When I was writing the 1838 part,
yeah.
I knew that I was writing about survival because it's a shipwreck. The ship blows up. People have to survive. But I was about a third of the way into the book when I realized that it was about more than just survival. It was about how do we survive the surviving. And so my main character in the modern day period had to mirror that, had to echo that theme. You can't have the modern story and the historical story, going off like this. They need to come together like this and then blend together. So she had to be dealing with the same overarching question of how do we survive the surviving. And for her, that was the death of her best friend when it could have and maybe should have been her. And I wanted her to be dealing with that while simultaneously learning about the women that we follow on the shipwreck.
All right. Staying in the present, so to speak, just for a moment. She's not in any way responsible for the death of her friend, but she feels guilty about it, guilty to the point of emotional paralysis. Is this, did you, the word research gives
yes,
me,
I did.
Gives me
yeah.
the willies, but did you research survivor guilt in that kind of context?
I did, and actually I love research. So it gives me the opposite of the willies. It makes me excited to dig deeper. And what I did was I interviewed people about trauma and how we hold it in our bodies and how what we do with trauma. Mm-hmm. So for her, that was a trauma. It was the world ripped into half before and after this moment. And so what does that mean in our bodies? What does that mean for us in the everyday world? And all the trauma experts I interviewed said, we all react differently. Some people process it. Some people do terrible things with their life because they're bitter, and that'll echo in 1838. And some people literally freeze up because they don't know what to do with it, and it's stuck in their bodies. Literally, it's an embodiment of the trauma. So I had Everly in modern day timeline. Her life is on hold. She does everything she needs to do, but nothing, she's not living life, she's just surviving.
Right.
So.
And there is a nice young man who would like to court Everly, but she's not available for
she's
anything.
Shut down, yeah.
When you have a disaster, in this case it's a single death. In the case of the explosion of the steamship, it's dozens, I don't know how many people, hundreds perhaps. You always have the question of who's in charge of this kind of thing? And both cases, the single death in 2019 and the multiple deaths at the explosion of the ship, people can't seem to get settled about whether this is chance or God's will. Yeah. Is the survivor, far from feeling guilty, does the survivor need to think she was saved for something special? How do you deal with that? Let's talk about Everly first, and then go back to the whole crowd on the ship.
So one of the questions that whenever I'm writing, what I think the book is about often changes in the writing, and it becomes something else entirely. And the question that kept rising up was how we address fate, destiny, meant to be. When somebody survives something, we say, "Oh, it was meant to be. You were meant to survive." Well, what does that say about the people who went down with the ship, your 5 siblings who passed away in the ship, or your best friend who was killed right next to you? And I wanted to face that question head on. I don't have any answers, but I sure can tell a story about it. And so I have all the characters kind of addressing the same things I was asking, which is there fate? Is there destiny? Is there a meant to be? And when I discovered one of the characters from the shipwreck had done terrible things with his life, it tossed up this thing we do where we say that they might be more worthy because they survived. And I wanted to throw that out the window.
Oh, the evening news, I mean, not a week would go by without something on the evening news perfectly infuriating. You know, plane crashes, 11 people die, 1 doesn't. And he or she says, I was saved for something special. Well, I hope so, but that's unlikely.
Well, and I wanted it to be as much about you were saved as, okay, now it's personal free will. Now it's choice. What do I do with my life? And do we have to be on a ship explosion or a plane crash to say, what can I do with my life that has purpose and meaning? And I think it's important.
That isn't going to require an airplane crash or a shipwreck.
Exactly.
The reason I had, I've read a lot of Southern history and literature and what have you, and I was familiar with upcountry summer homes. In Mississippi, they went to French Lick, Indiana. Did you know that?
I had no idea.
Yeah, there was a resort for rich Mississippi planters in Indiana. And in South Carolina, mostly, they went upcountry. They went into the hill country, and they had their retreat from yellow fever and miasma.
The bugs and the heat.
All of it.
Yep.
In your book, the rich citizens of Savannah, Georgia, get on a ship and they go to Saratoga Springs, New York. Yeah. You did not know this, but I taught high school there. I taught in Ballston Spa, New York, junior, senior high school. Yeah, I thought,
amazing.
I had no idea either when I was there or here. What did these families from Savannah went to upstate New York?
They went a little bit of everywhere. So the ship itself sailed from Savannah to Charleston, and then Charleston to Baltimore. And then from Baltimore, they could take trains, they could go wherever. But many people had their summer homes in upstate New York.
And they took their linen, china, clothes.
Gold,
silver, and some enslaved people.
Yes. If they were required, because once you were in Baltimore, you were across the line of freedom. So they would take their nursemaids or people that were required, but they left the rest of them at home. But yes, all their gold, all their silver, all their china, all their clothes,
so
they were moving.
So they could show off to each other in upstate New York as they had done back home and entertain.
Yes. Yep.
When you were messing around researching these migrations, these strange diasporas of the filthy rich.
That I had no idea about, yeah.
Did any of the slaves ever run off, escape? Did you come across that?
I did. I looked and I researched and I never found anything. That's not saying it never happened, but they were so careful about who they brought with them
I'll bet.
that, it was usually a nursemaid or a family where the rest of their family was back in Savannah or
Right,
Charleston.
right.
But the reason they took everything with them, including think about it, they didn't have paper money, they didn't have credit cards, so you took a trunk of gold and silver with you. Crazy.
And then there is, and I know nothing about steamships and boilers except what you've told me.
Yeah.
The boiler was red hot but empty. A stupid sailor, not knowing what he was doing, throws some buckets of cold water into the red hot boiler.
Yep.
And this causes
An explosion. He made a bomb. It was the second engineer, and it was 11 o'clock p.m., and the starboard boiler, say that 3 times fast, the boiler on the starboard side went empty. He poured in cold water, created a bomb, and it exploded at 11:04 p.m. It took 45 minutes for the ship to sink, but he blew a hole in the side of the ship. And it changed maritime law forever. From that point on, certified, decent engineers had to be on steamships. But yeah, an inexperienced second mate poured cold water.
They should have
in.
put up a big sign that said, "Do not throw cold water into the red hot empty boilers," but too late.
Too late.
So there's this explosion, and some people would just die. I mean, there a number of people.
Anybody near the explosion, yeah.
But then you get these survivors, at least temporary survivors. And I read this part and I thought, my mind wandered back and forth between being completely involved and bought in. And then once in a while I thought, do people floating on a life raft really have philosophical discussions about the nature of free will? And then I thought, well, yes, I think I would.
Day 4, you're probably talking about some, like, do you want to live? What does living mean? Yeah.
So they have these survivors who are floating along after when they're starving, they're dehydrating, they're baking, they're dying. Some of them are wounded, injured. But they have these conversations, and they're amazing. It's like a seminar on agency or destiny. The arguments are familiar ones, I suppose. What kind of a God would allow this to happen? And I thought instantly of the Holocaust. Apparently, atheism among Jews in Europe increased considerably after the 1940s.
Go figure.
In your gang, though, that was not your characters. That's not, of course, it was 1838 in the American South, which is another story, but that didn't seem to be the case. They were trying to figure out why it happened, not that there couldn't possibly be a God.
It's so interesting. All the accounts that I read, all the journals I read, all the newspaper articles I read, used these words over and over. God's providence. Over and over. The sermons at the memorials, the poems written about it, over and over. It wasn't, oh, therefore there must be nobody in charge, because this disaster is meaningless. A ship explodes, it goes down in 45 minutes, only a third of the people survive, and half of those third who survive are floating for 5 days and 5 nights in misery.
Oh, yeah.
Misery, and most of them pass away and are interned in the sea. And yet, God's providence over and over and over in every accounting. So I found that so fascinating, and also in the accountings I found, especially from my main character, who's based on a very real woman named Rebecca Lamar. Her accounting talks about what they talked about out there, how they were wondering how they got themselves into this and why them.
And whose fault?
And whose fault?
Is it some human's fault? Is it the deity's fault? If so, why?
So it's early 1800s. It's America's very young. It's been settled not for long. We don't even really have our own money. A lot of the money found at the bottom of the ocean, which they've been diving and bringing up the remnants of this shipwreck, are Spanish doubloons. They're European money. So they're still bringing that with them, and it's the South. So combine those, and you have a lot about providence and God's will going on.
And the money is interesting because one of the things, the reaction of individuals to losing their material wealth.
Yeah.
Some people say, "Oh, at least I'm still alive."
Yeah.
And other people say, "Oh,
I don't want to be alive. I just lost everything. That's all that matters." Yeah.
yeah."
Yeah.
And some people could rearrange their value system, and some people didn't.
And some people buckle down and double down and say, I lost everything and I'm going to get it back in spades, and spend the rest of their life committing atrocities to gather more.
Well, you have a kind of a villain.
I do. And he's real. I didn't even have to make him up.
A man who becomes this famous rich slave trader.
Yes.
Now, why was he saved? To do something special, to
Right.
be the world's meanest slave trader.
To earn it. So this young boy was 14 years old on the ship. He was very real. His real name was Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar.
Oh, boy.
And he was Lafayette because Lafayette was at his baptism.
Oh.
He came from a very influential Savannah family. And during the 5 days and 5 nights at sea, he earned himself a nickname, which was the Noble Boy, for helping others, for offering his last drop of liquid. And then 20 years later, he had a new nickname, the Red Devil. And not just because he had red hair and a bushy red beard, but because he was committing horrible atrocities to humankind, including sailing a luxury schooner with the New York Yacht Club pennant to the Congo in a retrofitted luxury yacht for human cargo.
Oh, he was a scoundrel.
He was a scoundrel. And so interesting, he was the last man to die in the Civil War.
Oh.
Shot straight through the heart from his horse in Columbus, Georgia, 4 days after Lee had already surrendered at Appomattox.
There are,
Karma?
yes, in this case, but it's always really weird to think about that the soldiers down at outside of Mobile, the great battles around Mobile were fought after Lee had surrendered. And you just need to get the word out quicker.
I know.
I would not want to have been in the First World War or the Second or any
war for
and
that
be
matter.
the last guy. You just think
know.
I should have stayed in bed this morning. This didn't have to happen.
Fighting for something that's already been lost. It's
yes.
For me, that was a real gut punch. He died fighting for something that was already lost after he had spent his life performing atrocities on the human race. But he had been saved. He had found salvation while all his siblings died. Why?
Well, I don't
It's
know.
meaningless, right? Yeah.
The two time periods, obviously, the explosion of the Pulaski. By the way, did you notice in Stephen Crane's The Open Boat?
Haven't read it yet.
Oh, well.
Sorry, I'm going to.
There's a wonderful scene where the rowboats are from a shipwreck, are getting closer and closer to shore, and they come to the surf. And they're only a few yards from dry land, but their danger to them is increased hugely.
And that's exactly what happened on this ship.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
I promise to read The Open Boat today. That is crazy. And in all the accountings, everyone who survived on the lifeboats, so there were 4 lifeboats on the steamship Pulaski, only 2 were seaworthy. And you think they would have learned by the time they got to the Titanic, but I guess not. So they make it all day and all night. They rowed ashore, and then they hit the breakers.
Yeah.
And they know they have to go over them because they can't, but they're going to get thrown out. And so even those who made it on the lifeboat didn't make it to shore when shore was right there.
Right. 2 things. One more thing about surviving Savannah, and that is the way you tied the 2019 to 1838. And your protagonist is a historian, Everly, and she has a conversation with her friend's mother about the nature of exploring the past. Everly is a historian. She wants to know about the past. But her friend's mother says, let it be, leave it lie. There's nothing you can do about it. The past is dead. But of course, it is Everly's salvation.
Yes. Oh, you just gave me goosebumps.
Not really, it's your book.
I know, but the way you said it means you really get it, which makes me really happy. What is it? Who is it? Faulkner, who says the past is never past.
Past isn't dead, it isn't even past.
Thank you. And I think for us as novelists and historians and teachers, we know that, right? We know that I think I have a line in there, it walks next to us, it breathes next to us. It's part of who we are. And we were talking a minute ago about the trauma experts that I interviewed. It actually lives in us, the past. Yeah. Our past, epigenetics shows that our ancestors' past live in us. Like, it's there. So we ignore it at our own peril, or our own growth. And I wanted Everly to know that and to think about it and to talk about it. So.
And she researches the shipwreck, she finds the documents, she reconstructs what happened, and in so doing, basically, saves herself. I always try to end an interview asking the writer, what is it you're working on next? Well, I don't have to ask it. Well, actually, that's still a good question, because since we last spoke, you've not only published Surviving Savannah, but another book. This time, you circled back to the C.S. Lewis.
I did.
Once Upon a Wardrobe is the new book. Why?
Okay.
And what is it?
So I am consistently fascinated by what I call origin stories. Mm-hmm. Where do books come from? Where do ideas come from? That dreaded question you get, I get, when people interview us, which is, where do your ideas come from? I don't know, I have a box on my desk, and only authors know about the box, and we dig in. But when I wrote Becoming Mrs. Lewis, every once in a while I would see something in Lewis's life and go, oh, that's in Narnia.
Yes.
Oh, that's in Narnia. Yeah. And I'm talking the littlest things, from his childhood trips to Dunluce Castle, or the day his mother died when he was 9 years old. And yet, so I put all that on the back burner because it really had nothing to do with their love story or how they came together in Becoming Mrs. Lewis. So when the pandemic hit, I had started a book about this, and then this book became my daily touchstone. So what it's about, it is about an 8-year-old boy named George and his sister Megs, and they live in Worcester, England. The year is 1950. And in the winter of 1950, in November of 1950, a new book blew onto the scene. And the book was called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It was the first in what would become, obviously, a 7-part series, but nobody knew that at the time. It was just a brand new book. Yeah. And everybody was in love with this book. And my character, George, is very ill. He's 8 years old, and he is obsessed with it. Yeah. He hides in his wardrobe. He wants to know if it's real. So he asks his sister, who is a math and physics genius and attends Oxford University, to track down the author who teaches at her university and ask him, where did Narnia come from? And she doesn't want to do it because she is a math major and thinks the world is founded on the principles of physics and equations. But she does because she loves her brother. And she finds Mr. Lewis and she says, where did Narnia come from? And it's not the answers you think, and everybody ends up on adventures, and that's what the book is about.
All right. Now, in 1 minute, since that book is actually finished,
yes.
the question still applies. What are you working on now?
Oh, wow. So I just finished Once Upon a Wardrobe, and I'm still out talking about Surviving Savannah. So my idea is muddy at best, but definitely has something to do with the impact of fairy tale in our lives.
All right. I'm not surprised. Another 6 months. Actually, the Wardrobe book comes out in October?
October 19th it comes out.
And so this show will air well before that, but people can have a look out for it.
Oh, they can go pre-order.
And then, and then we'll we'll get organized with the fairy tale book sometime in the future. Patti, thank you. As always, it's a great pleasure.
It's so much fun talking to you. Thank you for having me.